Halo's universe is no stranger to atrocities or extreme loss of life. Oh god, this video is definitely getting demonetized. During the Human Covenant War, casualties were in the billions, and that's just counting the humans that died. If you factor in all the Covenant that died, then, well, the number is higher than a grunt if it takes its mask off. The means in which these crimes against nature were committed only make matters worse. Vaporization by superheated plasma, consumption by a galactic body malforming parasite, asphyxiation via exposure to the vacuum of space, the list just goes on. But the thing is, all of these extreme losses of life can quite easily be explained away as just the casualties of war. A war of galactic proportions, with two factions hell-bent on exterminating everything in the galaxy in their own special ways. But what if I told you that arguably the most egregious war crime in all of Halo lore happened before any of this? Before we ever even encountered the Flood? Before we ever even encountered an alien? That's right, I'm talking some good old-fashioned human-on-human crimes against humanity. It seems no matter how far into the future we go, we just can't escape that constant urge to kill each other.
Time is a flat circle.
Today, we're taking a trip to the distant colony of Far Isle, home to the darkest mark on humanity's history. But first, I need to set the stage and talk about the events that led up to the Far Isle incident, so to speak. Oh, and if you enjoy learning about war crimes and other dark bits of lore from Halo's universe and other universes as well, then make sure you subscribe, because that kind of content is kind of my speciality. The 21st through 25th century was a time of great expansion for humanity. We spread our wings and started to explore the galaxy, establishing colonies and functioning societies on distant planets. But with those societies came governments, and with those governments came disagreements. Ultimately, much of human life on these colonies was still dictated by entities on Earth, and as you can expect, this dictation by a foreign power was not exactly well liked, especially among the distant outer colonies. As early as the 22nd century, civil unrest began to reach a boiling point, descending humanity into its greatest war since World War II, the Interplanetary War. Ironically, this war was actually fought by near-identical factions and ideologies as World War II. Neo-communists, known as the Kozloviks, rose up in mining cities on Mars in response to exploitation by government-backed corporations, and neo-fascists, known as Freedoms, surfaced as a result of rising anti-Kozlovik sentiment on the moons of Jupiter, and were backed by corporations funded by the United German Republic, who had been targeted by Kozlovik terror attacks. Now, interestingly, the Freedom movement actually shared some of the same anti-government sentiments as the Kozloviks. There was some common ground between the two, but they never unified on it. Wars between the Kozloviks, Freedoms, and the United Nations raged from the 2150s until 2170, and ended up being the maiden voyage, so to speak, of the UNSC. Their ground assault and shipboarding tactics were extremely effective, so much so that they became the standard protocol for all future conflicts, and they even also tested the first ever bio-augmented troops, which of course became the foundation for the much later Spartan program. UNSC pencil pushers made good use of the war as well, using it as grounds for rampant propaganda and recruitment efforts, solidifying themselves as the peacekeepers of humanity. After a brutal 2-year-long war on Mars, which the UNSC spent the majority of bombing Kozlovik holdouts and finishing what the Freedoms had started on the planet, the neo-communist leader, Vladimir Kozlov, was assassinated. Now, the official story was that the Freedoms killed Vladimir Kozlov, but that was not exactly well believed. Most people believed that was a cover-up by the UNSC, who took him out themselves as a means to break the faction. With the Kozloviks now weakened and leaderless, the UNSC turned their head to the Freedoms. With lightning efficiency, they initiated full-scale invasions of the Freedom strongholds on Jupiter's moons, and stamped out all Freedom resistance, before clearing up the stragglers of both the Freedoms and the Kozloviks that had managed to scatter across the galaxy. This resulted in a clean and crushing victory for the United Nations, and led to the representatives of all three factions signing the Callisto Treaty in 2170. In addition to enforcing a ceasefire, this treaty also forced the extremist group's hands and had them agree to give the UNSC total military jurisdiction across all human colonies. It also established the United Earth Government, or UEG, a central Earth-based government which would hold power over Earth and all of its colonies. So, the result of the war was the thing that started the entire war becoming a lot worse. And with that in mind, it should be absolutely no surprise to anybody watching right now that the establishment of the UEG formed the basis of almost every major conflict that humanity would face for almost the next 400 years until they encountered the Covenant. The UEG, much like their predecessors, were extremely overbearing, especially on the distant colonies, which led to the birth of the Insurrection, a movement that was mostly in those outer colonies and was devoted to total liberation from the UEG and the UNSC, who they believed oppressively controlled their lives. Because of how extreme the insurrection was, their ideology spread like wildfire. Civilians were quick to take up arms for the cause, and also many UNSC Marines defected to support them, and were led by former commanders and generals of the UNSC who had done the same, driven by the belief that their former faction had simply become too oppressive. For the insurrectionists, peace was never an option. The UEG just simply didn't care about their lives and would enforce harsh laws and taxes without any regard for their societies or even any knowledge of how their colonies functioned, and then any kind of kickback would be quickly and efficiently stamped out by the UNSC colonial policing. To the insurrectionists, diplomacy and democracy were just lost causes at this point. Violent action was their only means of protest. And although the UNSC's official war against the insurrection didn't begin until 2494, conflicts between the two broke out centuries prior. At some point, likely in the 24th century, the Hydra system was plagued by pirates and insurrectionists, which led to a series of events known as the Hydra System Massacres. Now, I think you can tell where this one is going. Although the Hydra system was under the jurisdiction of the UEG, it was distant and near lawless, so the clear-cut war crimes that took place there never really saw any repercussions. And what were those war crimes, I hear you ask? Well, they involved nuclear weapons, so nice and ethical. Basically, whenever the UNSC forces would move through the system, they'd hand out good old-fashioned nuclear justice to the innies and the pirates. I think that's all I need to say. These tensions only continued to rise in the years following. In the 24th century, there were some wars that took place in the inner colonies that were, fittingly named, the Inner Colony Wars. Now, very little is known about these wars. We don't even know who fought in them, but considering they took place long before first encounter with the Covenant, it's safe to assume that on one side you had these overbearing governments, and on the other side you had pissed off militarized civilians. Now, interestingly, although these wars never reached Earth, apparently unformatted news reports on Earth about these wars caused massive civil unrest on the planet and even almost tore Earth's culture apart. Whether this was some kind of innie propaganda that successfully made it through Earth's airwaves, or just media outlets relying on shock and horror for viewing figures, I don't know. It's just interesting to note how sheltered Earth's inhabitants were at this time from the goings-on of the rest of the colonies. But it was in the late 25th century where these tensions reached their apex, culminating in the most egregious war crime in human history. A crime so egregious that the highest of higher-ups at ONI didn't even think it was real. They thought it was innie propaganda because of how extreme it was, which, considering ONI's standards, is extreme and then some. Because of the sheer morbidity of what happened on Far Isle, accounts of the event are brief. Most information likely got redacted enough times to cause a black ink shortage in the inner colonies, but given how bad the available information makes the event seem, it doesn't even bear thinking about how bad the redacted information is. So, what happened? In 2492, an uprising began on the UEG colony world of Far Isle. Now, the specifics of what caused this uprising are currently unknown, likely heavily redacted, but we can theorize. There's the obvious assumptions that it was sparked by the UEG enforcing heavy taxes and levies on the planet, and or the UNSC's draconian policing, but this wasn't a regular uprising. It was far more aggressive than the typical uprisings they were used to, and so it may have been caused by a decision made by the UEG 5 years prior. In 2487, two groups of insurrectionists, the People's Occupation, based on Reach, and the Secessionist Union on Eridanus II, came together and submitted formal requests to the UEG on behalf of a dozen colony worlds to secede from the UEG and become independent colonies. It was a rare, peaceful offering from the insurrection, likely a dream come true for many state officials, but unfortunately, the UEG could not have handled this situation any worse. They immediately denied the request without a second thought. This made it clear to the insurrectionists that the UEG weren't even willing to listen to reasonable, peaceful offerings, and it only reinforced their belief that violence was the only way to free themselves from their oppressors. It made the cause seem so much more legitimate to those who maybe weren't fully on board before, and it was likely one of the main sparks that ignited the rebellion on Far Isle. But like I said before, this wasn't a typical rebellion. It was much, much worse. It was like the colony's collective tipping point had finally been reached. The UNSC intervened to try and quell the rebellion, but all attempts to either de-escalate or stamp it out entirely just failed. The culmination of centuries of oppression, neglect, and mistreatment reared its ugly head to face its oppressors, and was simply too much for them to handle by regular means. The shining beacon of humanity's military were hopeless to stop it, and so desperate measures were enacted. On a redacted date in 2492, UNSC GATL-1 longswords broke through Far Isle's atmosphere and, for lack of a better phrasing, nuked the colony and all of its inhabitants to high hell. As far as we know, not a single person on Far Isle survived the explosion or the subsequent radiation. Every single man, woman, and child on the entire planet was killed in a horrific manner for simply wanting independence from an overbearing and draconian government. As the mushroom clouds began to rise, the UNSC declared Code Bandersnatch across all channels, which indicates a major radiological or energy-based disaster. Now, interestingly, slightly off topic, the code Bandersnatch has only ever been used for two events in human history. The first was whenever the Covenant would glass a planet, and the second was by Cortana on Delta Halo to warn the rest of the UNSC about both Tartarus's intent to fire Delta Halo, but also that the flood outbreak on the ring was out of control and that it had almost entirely infected High Charity, which was slipspace capable, and thus was able to break out of Delta Halo's atmosphere and go anywhere it wanted. Now, going back to Far Isle, we don't know precisely which nukes were used to annihilate the colony, but given that they were dropped by longswords, we can narrow it down. Longswords carry either Shiva-class nukes or Havoc tactical nukes, both of which have seen extensive use in humanity's spacefaring age. Shivas are your standard thermonuclear bombs, whereas Havocs are what's known as clean nukes, where the blast is created by nuclear fusion over nuclear fission. So basically, a hydrogen bomb over an atom bomb, and thus a bomb with a significantly higher potential yield. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the nukes were clean or dirty. The inhabitants of Far Isle met an awful fate regardless. Any regions of the planet unaffected by the initial blast would have been plunged into a harsh nuclear winter, the ground made infertile and unlivable, and radiation as abundant as oxygen. If the blast didn't get them, then they likely met an even worse, slow, agonizing death at the hand of starvation, the elements, or, God forbid, extreme radiation poisoning. What happened on Far Isle, along with an incident 2 years later known as the Callisto Incident, in which a UNSC ship broke all laws of warfare and raised a white flag to an enemy ship before lowering the flag as it approached and attacking them off guard, very, very unethical, acted as one of the major sparks of humanity's next great war, the Human Insurrection War, our last major conflict before the Covenant arrived. The UNSC officially declared war on the insurrection sometime in 2494, 2 years after the Far Isle incident, and for the next 31 years, the two were locked in vicious warfare that didn't even let up when the Covenant War broke out, and that as far on as nowadays is still a major thorn in the UNSC's side. Because of the core beliefs of the insurrection and the way that humanity operates in the 26th century, it's unlikely that the UNSC or any military or non-military force will ever truly stamp out this rebellion. Rebelling against a higher force is just a core part of human nature, and the insurrection is just a militarized embodiment of this key part of the human psyche. That also means that although Far Isle may be the UNSC's greatest war crime as of now, it likely won't be forever. I'm sure at some point they'll end up using a planet-cracking Nova bomb on an Ini colony, or using Ini POWs in experiments with the Flood, or something absolutely awful like that. Given what we know about Oni, I'd say it's only a matter of time until they orchestrate something even worse than nuking an entire planet of people purely because they don't want to live under the draconian rule of the UEG and the UNSC. And you know, when the time comes, your boy's gonna be covering it in yet another disturbing Halo lore video, so make sure you subscribe if you enjoyed this video and don't want to miss that one when we eventually cover it. If one thing is certain in life, it's that Oni are always going to try and up their last war crime, so I can assure you, at some point, that video will happen. And that is the disturbing tragedy of Far Isle, the worst war crime in Halo lore. For now. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as you can enjoy a video about something as dark and depressing as this. If you did, then make sure you leave a like down below. And with that said, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual. And thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll catch you all in the next one.